much that parable has been a part of my sobriety journey and how I think about it. So, for those who don't know it, can you share that with us?
Sure. It goes like, well, I mean, there's different versions of it, but the version I tell goes like this. There's a grandparent talking with a grandchild, and they say, in life, there are two wolves inside of us that are always at battle. One is a good wolf, which represents things like kindness and bravery and love. And the other is a bad wolf, which represents things like greed and hatred and fear. And the grandchild stops and they think about it for a second. And they look up at their grandparent. And they say, well, which one wins? And the grandparent says, the one you feed.
Yeah.
So that's the parable, and like you, it was enormously influential to me in my sobriety journey. I'm sure I heard it in the first few months of being sober somewhere, and just immediately landed on me like, oh yeah, okay, I have a choice here. Like my actions, my thoughts, my behaviors, these things are going to influence, what direction I go. And I have a choice in that.
Yeah. And how, as you were sort of moving through that early sobriety journey, because I know it's not easy from my own personal experience, did you at moments say, okay, I get to choose whether I feed the bad wolf or the good wolf?
Well, choice is an interesting thing that I think about a lot, because it's really interesting to think about how much choice do we have at different points around different things. I don't think choice is equally, that we all have the same amount of choice in all situations, right? So I know that the amount of choice I have today about whether I put alcohol or another substance in my body, I feel like I have a huge degree of choice. Early on, that degree of choice felt very little. It did not feel like I had a lot. So I think that, yes, I did know on some level, well, no one else will get me drunk or high besides me. So it's at some level, yes, I am making a choice, but boy, it did not feel like an easy choice at times. It did not feel almost like a possible choice. I mean, I feel like a lot of times, I stayed sober, 51% of me wanted to and 49% didn't. But that was enough. That was enough. And then there were other days where it changed. And now, it's like, I mean, 100% to zero most of the time.
Yeah.
And so I think it speaks to the fact that, yeah, we do have a choice. And my experience and most people in recovery is that choice gets easier over time. In the beginning, for me, it felt like being torn apart inside,
Yeah.
because one part of me is like, I can't, I can't, I can't. And the other part of me is screaming, you have to, you have to, you have to. And it's an awful, awful feeling. And so, I think that's one of, like, if that's what recovery was, you lived like that, I don't think anybody would stay sober, right? Like
Yeah.
it's too hard. And we often confuse what it's like getting sober with what it's like to be sober. And, I think that's a really important point, is that your degree of choice will change. That was a long answer to a short
Oh my
question.
God, I loved it. And I think that you described it really, really well. That now you feel like your ability to choose whether or not you drink, you put a substance in your body is very, very clear. But in the beginning, that, the fight of the wolves, the good and the bad, is really difficult. And I always think of drinking, which was my experience, like a magnet. The closer you are to it, the stronger the pull is to
Yeah.
go back to drinking. And the further away you get for it, it's like that magnetic force. It becomes less and less and less. And that was one of the reasons I mentioned, and folks who listen to this podcast a lot will know that I call the addictive voice in my head that tells me drinking is a good idea, Wolfie. And my coach called it that, but it's based on that parable. And the idea is that if you drink, you're feeding the wolf, and the wolf
Yeah.
gets really strong. And the
Yep.
longer you go without feeding your addictive voice, without drinking, without feeding the bad wolf, you sort of starve him. And the weaker and weaker and weaker it gets. So to the point where I, to this day, I quit drinking 6.5 years ago, have a leather keychain on my car keys with the initials FUW, standing for fuck you, Wolfie. And I used to rub it when I was kind of having a hard time. So
Yeah.
all that is to say is that parable does actually mean a whole lot to me. And your analogy makes perfect sense.
Yeah. It, it's interesting. The analogy that I heard early in sobriety that always really helped me was, and it's similar. I hadn't connected the two. I hadn't connected it to the parable, and so you just did for me. Is that we used to say like cravings are like stray cats. You know, if you feed them, they're going to keep coming around. But if you stop feeding them, sooner or later they'll get the message. There's no food here, and they'll move on. And I had not connected that to the wolf parable, all it being about feeding. But that was really helpful for me. I'll tell you, sometimes I think I stay sober on simply never wanting to have to get sober again. Like I think to myself, like I know I have enough experience to know that were I to drink again, I would end up in the same place, which would mean I would have to get sober. And I don't ever want to go through that again. Like it just was, particularly for me, I got sober twice. The second time was way harder. And I think there's a variety of reasons for that, but I don't want to do it again.